Good. Okay. Good morning, everybody. So let's start, please. So I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for the last seminar of 2022. Chris Smit is visiting us from the Netherlands, where he's a professor at the University of Groningen, where he leads the Conservation Ecology Group. He's a community ecologist that uses large-scale field studies for his work and also has a keen interest in their application in conservation management and policy.
Yeah,
so
correct.
With that, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for this opportunity. And what an honor to be the last speaker of this year. I had no idea. And special thanks also to Louise for arranging this day. I'll be around also next week still. I'll leave on Friday, and I'm thrilled to and very eager to also to meet with some of you and have a chat if you'd like to. I'm in Quince Bay apparently, so you can visit me. And I must say I had a wonderful 3 days in the field with Nacho and Louise and Jorge as well. So I already got an idea of how the Doñana area looks like. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, well, actually two things. The title says the grazing. I'll promise I'll talk about grazing with the large herbivores as conservation management, something that we do a lot in the Netherlands and Western Europe. And I have worked on that quite a bit. What do we not know? Well, I'll just give an update on what at least I think we know in Groningen and what and some future perspectives. And I also promise to work a bit on the return of the wolf to the Netherlands, which is something that happened recently, and I also happen to work on that, also thrilling. And I think for questions we should wait until the end, unless things are really unclear and urgent, so then interrupt me then. But if not, rather for the last, also for the online people, right? Okay, and a little introduction of myself. So indeed, I'm a community ecologist. I work on all kinds of interactions between species. I started as a plant ecologist. Plant-plant interactions and facilitation and how herbivores change those interactions. And then since a few years I also added large predators to that, including the wolf and also feral cats and domestic cats. And I tend to work not just in one system, but rather compare processes between systems. So here there's many different systems that I studied together with my group. There's now about 8 PhD students. Some of them are about to finish coming year or handed in their thesis. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here, and coming once I'm on a sabbatical to actually write some grant proposals to get new people in. Some examples of the studies. So yeah, I've been in Murcia and Alicante to work in these shrub steps or these stipa steps and positive plant-plant interactions under stress. A lot of grazing work done in several ecosystems. The notorious Osvars Pleasant, some of you may have heard of them, some not, but I will explain more in detail. So we have some long-term monitoring in Junnerkoeland, that's in the Netherlands, a tiny little place, but at least we have been monitoring for 30 years the impact of grazing. Same with the salt marshes, even longer, 50 years. And there we happen to have these feral cats that also have cascading impacts on the herbivores and then the vegetation. That's something we study. I'm interested in all kinds of things, also interactions of juniper, which is a rare shrub in the Netherlands, and it's mycorrhiza. So we explored the mycorrhiza community, and it's it's hampered by the nitrogen deposition that we have a lot in the Netherlands. We have a large issue at the moment with nitrogen deposition because of the farming activities, and this species is on decline because of that, because of the mycorrhiza that are hampered by that. And then lastly, how particularly the return of the wolf impacts ungulates. We see some red deer here, and cascading impact on vegetation. We do that at the Veluwe area, also in the Netherlands, and I've been studying that together with my colleague Dries Kuiper in Poland for a while. So just to get you an overview, this is my building, brand new green flashy building in Groningen, and I'm at the G-Life Center. Yes, so that's a little bit more background. Okay, but let me start with where it started for me and for some of us in Groningen. And we just talked about Herbert Prince. You two know Herbert Prince, and he actually also did his PhD. He's quite a famous savanna ecologist, and he also started in these grazed grasslands under supervision of Jan Bakker, my predecessor. And for those that don't know, this is the Netherlands. And on the top we have 5 Waddenzee islands. This is Schiermonnikoog, hard to pronounce. Don't try, or you can. At Schiermonnikoog we have a lovely field station. It's brand new. It was opened last year. So you're all welcome. It fits only 40 people. But if you want to have a look and contact me, and if you want to collaborate, there's always options. Because we have, for example, long-term grazing there. And in short, the left-hand side grazed for 50 years, livestock. On the right-hand side, same salt marsh, same age, about 120 years old. And you see succession speeds up and dominated by one grass, Elatrigia aterica. And here we have plenty of other species. And here a closer look at the grazing by cattle in this case, and also typical patchiness that you see. And this resembles also something that I saw yesterday in the Doñana, together with Louise, the patchiness of Juncus species in the middle of other short-grazed grasslands. And that's something I'd like to work on more, and perhaps also in collaboration here. Would be cool. Now, this is something I usually show my students. I'm going to ask the same question here, because there's a question behind this blue, so be prepared. It will be interactive. This is my predecessor. This is in Dutch. Started in 1970 when the marshes were grazed again. And then the managers wanted to know, well, what's more profitable for the recovery of plants, the plant communities? Grazing or mowing or not doing anything? So he started exclosures. He set up 5 fairly large exclosures where some of the plots were mown and some were left alone and some were grazed. And this is what happened over the years. And I'm going to ask you, this is the number of species in 2x2 plots. And then the question I always ask my students, well, which is what? Which one of these 3 lines is the grazing? Which of the 3 lines is the mowing? Or which is doing nothing? Mowing. I tend to teach a lot, so that's my...
Mowing is the top.
Mowing is the top.
I think grazing. Grazing.
Well, and you could say it depends.
Nothing is the top.
Nothing is the top.
Okay, all 3.
Well, at least in our system, this is old-fashioned mowing then, but the grazing led to a higher diversity. And mind you, it's all started at 7 species per 2x2 square meter, which is not a lot. These are typical salt marshes with more or less 12 typical species. But indeed, the grazing led to a higher diversity. And then this is another old book, Gerlonda, and I actually translated this picture over the weekend. I had nothing else to do here, and well, it was raining a lot. I thought, let's translate this. It's theory, but I find it fascinating, published in the late 90s. And the idea behind this, and probably familiar to many of you that know about grazing, is that grazing as compared to mowing leads to differences in your vegetation structure and your soil, notably the horizontal and vertical stratification is larger, right? So there's more variation here. And also in the soil, the microtopography, because of the trampling, right, that the large herbivores do, you have all kinds of interactions with ants, for example, or dung, so it leads to much more heterogeneity in the vegetation and in your soil. Whereas mowing generally, well, depends on how often you mow and perhaps on the system, but tends to lead to more uniform structure. Hence, a higher floral fauna diversity here and lower floral fauna diversity on the right-hand side. That's at least the theory, right? Cool thing is that I was able to continue these studies. So now we have data until 2022. So it's 50 years of grazing and mowing in just the salt marsh. And both of these guys are already retired now. These are the field assistants that helped. And in the end, it was physically also too hard for them to do this. So this is work of a former PhD student of mine, and she kept on analyzing the data, and we saw the same pattern that in the ungrazed, the species decline continued. So the dominance of a few species increased, whereas and this is all kinds of combinations, grazing with mowing once per year, mowing twice per year, but at least the treatments with grazing led to a higher diversity. Okay, so let's step back a bit, zoom out perhaps. So grazing in the Netherlands is, has really kicked off since the 70s and 80s as a nature management. And we don't have much nature. We have a lot of green, but not so much nature. We have many small parks here and there. And among them, there's at least 500 sites, this is the Netherlands, that have some kind of grazing management. But there's a lot of variation in those sites, a lot of difference in grazers, in your type, in your regime, but also differences in aims. So why is there grazing? Right? It's mainly for conservation purposes or maintaining particular habitats, but also the results are quite variable. So it's quite interesting to once focus more on that and what actually works and what doesn't work. And you can roughly divide that grazing into two groups. So more cultural grazing and natural grazing. So cultural grazing, that is mimicking basically traditional land use. So we tend to have a lot of these heathlands, Kaluna and Petrum heathlands, purple heathlands, that are really a result of years of exploitation already since Middle Ages. Used to be birch and oak forest, but then coppiced, cut, exploited, and in the end you end up with these heathlands. Without the grazing of the sheep, it would again go back to forest, and the sheep grazing that's traditional land use. And nowadays it's also a valuable ecosystem that, according to Natura 2000 legislation, should be protected to some extent. So that's what I call cultural grazing. It's not really natural, it's really, there's a high level of human interference because there's rotational grazing and there's a lot of, you have a shepherd and all that. Now, and as opposed to that, we have sort of the natural grazing, where the aim is to develop more natural landscapes, natural communities. Focus is on restoring natural processes. And ideally, a low level of human interference. And some of you may have heard about rewilding, obviously, and that is a bit in that direction. And here this is the Scottish Highland cattle that are, well, quite self-sustainable, right? And we tend to use that a lot in the Netherlands and Western Europe. Some more theory on this natural grazing. And this is also a classical one, Hoffman, 89. So this natural grazing typically uses year-round grazing, right? So it's not seasonal, and not rotational grazing. Free-roaming herds, ideally, so composed of both males and females and a natural sex ratio. And you want to use the full assemblage of grazers and browsers. And for those not familiar with that, so the browsers are the concentrate selectors or the feeders, where we have here the typical roe deer that goes for the high quality food, namely the buds and that's a high quality. It also needs to be more active, the feeding rhythm is more active during the day. And at the other side we have, for example, cattle or the now extinct our ox. That's a bulk feeder that goes for low quality but large amounts. And then in between you have those intermediate feeders. Right, so like the red deer we have here. Actually that's interesting, this got recently updated because many of the species that we use and we see in natural ecosystems, or natural, semi-natural ecosystems, we're missing. So notably wild boar, now European bison is back, moose. We talked about donkey yesterday with Louise where to position it, and horses. So it got a bit expanded, but it's the same idea. Okay, so that's natural grazing, and ideally, of course, we also have a large spatial surface. So it doesn't work if you put all those animals in one small area, of course, although that's exactly what is happening in many natural areas. Many of the managers think, based on these ideas, okay, so we need to have a horse and deer and cattle and this and that, let's put them all in this 1 square meter. No management. We'll come back to that later. One of the effects, so grazing with large herbivores got quite popular in the 80s and 90s in the Netherlands. And one of the discussions and one of the underlying theories was actually this. So how open were our landscapes before we as humans had any impact on the lands? So that's before Neolithic times, so about 5,000 years ago. After that, we became farmers, basically, and we had more noticeable impacts on the landscape. But beforehand, how did our landscape look like? Was it, as many people thought, the classical view, really dark, close canopy forest? Or more like this, where we had our ox and tarpan and the now extinct large herbivores that were around once a day, right? And then the idea was, and that's the idea of Frans Vera with his book and his thesis that he wrote in the 90s, that the landscape looked like this, made open or maintained by the now extinct large herbivores. And then we came as humans with our livestock, and they kept actually those, they took over those landscapes. And it's an ongoing discussion, right? So there's pollen data that show, well, the landscapes may have been more open than we expected, and there's archaeological findings, and there's beetle, dung beetle data, paleo data, right? So there's pros and cons. And actually, well, would be not, I don't know whether you mentioned that you were more in historical ecology. Is this also something that you work on? Okay, good. We'll talk later about it. That's fascinating. I have some ideas about this. I'm not going to say who's wrong or right and what's a verdict. We don't really know, but it's moving towards a certain direction, of course. One of the underlying mechanisms, at least, independent of how open our landscapes were, is the shifting mosaics idea. Already published by my colleague sitting next door in Groningen, Han Olf. And he came up with this idea together with Frans Vera also. And I've been showing this so many times, but it still fascinates me. When you have your grazed woodlands, independent how natural they are, you typically see this. You have patches of shrubs and isolated trees and palatable grazing lawns. And they shift in time and space like this. So you have your grazing lawns, you may get your unpalatable species that are not liked so much by large grazers. In there you may get establishment of certain shrubs or woody species that expand, and then the trees gradually take over at that spot and they outcompete the shrubs. But once they die, the cycle may start all over again. So this is the cycling, shifting mosaic concept that we see actually a lot in many of our grazed woodlands and natural areas. This is one of those sites, the Groningen. It's a very small nature reserve in the Netherlands, 200 hectares, no more. But you see all those processes and all those phases in the landscape. And that's one of the sites we've been studying for more than 30 years. We worked a lot on that and published on each of those phases. So when you see this green, that shows that we found some evidence for those steps. Now this is only in one site, but basically this associational resistance in grazed ecosystems, you see that a lot in many sites. So I did my PhD in Switzerland on this phenomenon. I think that's this picture. This is in the Cabañeros site where I worked as a postdoc. This is in Sweden. This is yesterday. This is Doñana, Palmitos, with the wild olives, right? So it's everywhere. If you want to see what you want to see and you make a picture of that, then that's what you get, right? So those mechanisms, this associational resistance and this cyclic shifts of the mosaics, you can see that in many of those gray systems. Okay, so that's something. I'm going to have a sip of water. Now something new. I don't know whether this was new to many of you or not, but at least something I'd like to wanted to talk about. This is something more new. Ruth Houwesen, former PhD student of mine, she's South African, so she suffered our colds in the salt marshes, and I joined her for fieldwork in South Africa, and then we were in the unbearable heat, and I couldn't think because of the heat, so we always had to rely on each other's functioning brain. She found something very interesting, namely that in both systems are very similar. And at first sight you would say, well, grey salt marshes in the Netherlands and savannas, they're very different, and of course they are different, but many of the processes are very alike. she found that here you also have those grazing lawns, right? You have those palatable grasses, and those grasses get trampled upon. And so there's a positive feedback loop. You favor those grasses that can resist the trampling, and they're quite palatable. But you also have those patches that are avoided by the grazers. And this is Juncus maritimus in this case. It's not very tasty, and it's avoided. And because of that, we have here, this is the Orchestia camarellis. It's an amphipod. It's basically the earthworm of the salt marshes. Salt marshes are saline, so you don't get your earthworms. But here, this one penetrates in the soil, and it probes, and it aerates the soil. So you get more water infiltration, denitrification. So there's all kinds of processes and positive feedback loops in these patches. But not here, because here there's too much trampling and compaction. So you have on the one hand side compaction, and on the other hand bioturbation. And they are antagonistic, but there's moments where they sort of, where this expands or decreases. Now exactly that is happening here in African savannas, when you have your rhinos trampling the soil, and it's slightly heavier of course than there's more trampling than cattle grazing, forming those grazing lawns for decades, right? But you also have your bunch grasses that are less liked by these guys and girls. And the same thing happened. And then also in those patches there are many more bioturbators, like your termites and your ants and large earthworms. We've been told that they can be even 1 meter tall, incredible. And your dung beetles that also put their dung rather more towards those patches. And of course then you can also get new patches forming in those dung piles. So we did a lot of studies, experimental work, descriptive work, comparing both systems, and it was very nice to see that there's a lot of processes that are comparable. And in fact, we came up with this idea that if that is so, as long as your soil is compactable, and if it's not too dry and not too wet, then you have the ideal circumstance when you have grazers to get your patchy landscapes. So we actually looked at all different systems where you have this is our salt marshes, but there's many more, including kangaroos that do very similar things. And we came up with this large-scale map, quite bold in a way, but say, well, if it's not too dry or not too wet, but in the intermediate areas, and when it's not too sandy, but at least when there's some kind of clay or compactable soil, then you should get these patchy landscapes, and that's all the red. And that would be, and I think Doniana is somewhere here as well, which may explain why we found some of the patches. I got really intrigued over the last few days. Something to explore further. So I'm working now on a proposal. Actually, this morning I was opening up this, and I'd like to continue with this, to include not just those processes, but also the dynamics, so those patches. What drives the expansion and the decrease of those patches over time, and how that works. When you know that you have your bioturbators here and you have your grazers here compacting, this is grazing land, it's a bit too small, sorry. This is the aerial picture basically. So you have your patch, it expands over time, but there's a certain moment where it gets interrupted, probably because from the inside they get disrupted, cattle may enter again. There may be some facilitation going on of palatable species that are in the end found by your grazers, and then they break up. So you get an expansion and a decrease of your patches. And in fact, if that is happening, then you can also plot something on, the state of your ecosystem, if you will, your patchiness as a measure of the health of your ecosystem. And here you have your environmental stress or your grading pressure. And then, well, depending on if you're in a healthy state, you should have patches appearing and going. So the dynamics of your patches is sort of an indicator of your health. If there's no grazing, it should move into this side, so dominance of a few species. And alternatively, it could become sort of a plain, overgrazed. And then either the recovery, this is the biostability, it may be very difficult, or it's a gradual process, something we don't know. But this is, of course, highly confidential, right? So don't steal any of these ideas. I'm working on it now. Shh. Okay, so that's something on patches. I haven't talked about biodiversity yet. So let's talk about impacts of grazing on plant diversity in the first place. So this is my dear friend Juan Alberti from Argentina. I had to congratulate him painfully enough with the game, of course, last week. But anyways, that happens. You can, it's hard to see, we have here 5 exclosures, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that were set up in the early 90s. And this is the ungulates, again, this small area that we study a lot. And I'd like you to look at, these are those 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those blocks, 5 exclosures. This is percentage cover of the most dominant species. These are predominantly grasses. Well, carex and rumex are not grasses. And this is over time. So we started in 49 till 2002. I'm not going to explain all the treatments, but I'd like you to watch the full exclosure, the ambient here. So that's where no large herbivores and small herbivores can enter. And on the right-hand side, we have the controls where all grazers, smaller and large, actually do their grazing. And what you see is that in the full exclosures, in all 5 blocks, you see a coming and going of your dominant species. While as in your controls, it remains relatively stable. Those controls were richer on species. That's something we already know. So the diversity levels are higher, but they're constant over time. Whereas in your exclosures, it's lower diversity, but actually species do that. So, and there's more grass, I won't bother you with more grass, but actually the grazing in this community is more stable under grazing, which is an interesting finding. And this is, zooming out again, this is the work of Sally Corner, and this is our contribution. That's ungulates, the same sites, this site. This is a meta-analysis of 252 exclosure sites. A huge effort. But it's basically on a very similar theme. What are the impacts of grazing? And if you compare exclosures versus graze sites, and she collected on all continents, on many continents, all of those data. And mind you, it's a huge, you have very dry sites and very wet sites. So if you look at the scale here, your net prime production, it's huge variation. And yet you found something very interesting, namely, and this is here the effect of your herbivores on richness. It tends to be positive, right? So it's an even increase with your net prime production, which is nice. So it shows that in general on your plant diversity you have positive effects. There are of course also sites that have negative effects, right? But the average is positive, and it tends to increase with your productivity. That's something we already knew from some sites, but at this scale not. But the more important thing is here, and that's actually the mechanism. This is the Berger-Parker dominance, basically a measure for your dominance of your species. And this is again your effect on the richness. And see, if your dominance is reduced, then you find your positive effects of grazing. When your dominance increases, then you have your negative effects. In other words, one of the first slides I showed you, the positive effect of grazing, that is only when the dominance of particular species is stopped or reduced. That is the key mechanism how you get positive impacts of your grazing. And that's then independent of, and it's the same mechanism that you can apply to all those grazing sites. As long as you can break your dominance, then you have positive effects on your plant diversity, which is a nice message for managers, I would say. That's what you need to do. But you have to find, of course, at what level this happens. Okay, so now the question is no longer to graze or not to graze in the Netherlands, in those few areas that we have, but how to graze. Which species do you need and which densities then to break that dominance, right? So this is a large project that we ran. Actually, I arrived halfway when I got my position in Groningen. And we wanted to know the impact of grazing on biodiversity, but not just plants, but also on your insects, on your birds, and on the voles, in invertebrates. And this is the design. So we had basically cattle grazing, horse grazing, and different densities. So 1 head per hectare or half a cow per hectare. Sounds a bit silly, but and we even had the rotational grazing. And we followed up for 5 years what happened, what was most effective. Now these were 3 PhD positions, 2 postdocs in the end, and many papers came out from that project. This is a summary paper of Roel van Klink, a dear colleague. And in summary, I'll walk you through because it's too much information, you can't read anyways. This is plants, this is for the insects and pollinators, this is for your birds and the voles. Here it says the impacts of increased stocking density, and here it's the impacts of your species. For example, when you look at your vegetation height, you see that the more, the higher your stock density is, the lower your vegetation. That's no big surprise, perhaps. When you look at your patch or your plant species richness, then it increases in the high marsh, and there are no impacts of your stocking density in the low marsh. When we look at the birds, basically no large effects, equal effects, except for the trampling. Here, nest trampling. We did an experiment where sort of fake nests were put in for meadowbirds, and here we could see that there's at higher grazing densities more nests were trampled, and particularly by horses that tend to be more active. So we could directly say to the managers, if you want to graze the sites, that's good, but don't use horses, and certainly not at high densities if you care about your meadowbirds. Very practical. This was also translated into management recommendations. This is in Dutch, but this says horses, this says cattle, and the greener, the better, basically, for all kinds of diversity components. So you could see that the 0.5 cattle per hectare was the best. Red is negative. And so that's the recommendation it was the best for diversity of most of those factors. Okay, how am I doing in time? Good? Yeah? Yeah. Well, I'll go. I'm spending more time on this actually, but I'd like to also include something on the wolf. I should say something on the wolf, right? Yeah, 50 minutes should be okay. I'll try to stay focused. Rewilding. Rewilding is hot. Rewilding Europe, they get a lot of money. It's very fashionable. It has something very positive to it as well, because who can be against revival of nature and getting more nature, a wilder nature, right? I think it's a very strong idea as well. There's very cool books written. I particularly like this one, Feral by George Monbiot, and Wilding, if you want to read something nice during Christmas. Rewilding sites are expanding all over the world. There's a bias, of course, it's more in the United States and in Europe. And we have some very cool studies as well. Jens Christian Svenning is producing most papers on this theme. He actually followed an experiment where the straight-tusked elephant, or circus elephants basically, were reintroduced for a week in the wild in Denmark, and published about. So that's also rewilding, bringing back elephants to Denmark. Cool, huh? But it includes also bringing back wild boar to Scotland, other extinct animals replaced by similar-looking species that have similar functions, right? One of the points still is that most papers written about rewilding are conceptual papers, reviews of those concepts, and opinion papers, how they feel about the reviews of those concepts. Right, so and where to place rewilding in restoration and conservation? Is it something? There's different types of rewilding, Pleistocene rewilding, bringing back ancient species, or replacing. Is it passive rewilding, sort of hands-off? All cool ideas, but where's the data, right? So that's something that more and more people are working on now, but it's still limited. But we happen to have this Osvars Pleasant site, now arguably one of the oldest rewilding sites in Europe. Not my words, but that's how it's been picked up. Who knows about Osvars Pleasant? Have some of you heard about Osvars Pleasant? A few, okay. This is the Netherlands. This is below sea level. It's an area of about 60 square meters. Wet parts, marshlands, and dry parts. Mind you, there is a lot of water pumped out because we're 7 meters below sea level at certain areas. Yet it's rewilding. We have introduced in the late, so this was reclaimed land in the 60s. It was meant for agriculture. You can still see it. You have those straight paddocks here, but never really realized because there was an economic crisis by then, and then it's sort of recovered naturally, became very interesting marshlands with nice bird species particularly. And then Transfera, also the founding father of this site actually, they said, well, let's make it a nature reserve. And so they were successful, and in the 80s and 90s, hack cattle, Koning horses, and red deer got introduced. And not just introduced, they actually said, well, let's see what happens with those numbers. Let's not interfere. Only they had this early reactive culling, it was called. So during winter times, when animals looked really bad, they had this score from 0 to 5. The managers would shoot those animals that were not likely to survive the winter. So it was called early reactive culling. So it didn't really starve or die of starvation, but they were killed. Now, what happened there? Originally, you had many reedlands, so tall vegetation types with a lot of shrubs. And that gradually became, well, we got rid of the shrubs by the browsing and the grazing, and it's gradually opened up. Here you see how the numbers expanded. Some grew exponentially. In red, it's the red deer, and they sort of started to fluctuate at, well, if you will, carrying capacity. We had a discussion on that with Louise. You can wonder if that's true, but at least it grew nearly exponentially and then started to level at a certain amount. And this is the Koning horses and the cattle and the geese that can fly in and fly out. They are still expanding. We did exclosure studies, of course. That's what you do when you work in herbivores. You build large fences. We planted some trees inside and outside, published on that, but you know, this is where we planted the trees. They didn't survive. However, in the 1 meter fence, and this is 2 meter fence, this is the full exclosure, but even in the 1 meter fence, there was survival. Red deer did jump in occasionally. They did the browsing, but they did survive that. So there's chances there, I would say. But we did more. We followed, so this is a story about Osvars Pleasant. People like it or people hate it. It's now sort of stopped as it is, unfortunately, in my opinion. But it's always said that it's a failed experiment now and that it came at the cost of the biodiversity. And I doubt that. And this is the reason why. Roel van Klink, again. And we studied in the exclosure, that's the fourth one here, and this is in the vegetation type, short vegetation at start, and the other one was tall vegetation at start of the experiment, and different distances from that exclosure. And we looked 2 years after, 2 years, it's a very productive system. What are the impacts on the diversity? Plants in this case. Plants, only one species in the exclosure. It's the dominance, again, Sally Kerner's work, right? Urtica dioica. Whereas in the graze site, 1 square meter, we have 10 plant species still, independent of the distance from the exclosure, in both areas. So how did then your herbivores, insects, herbivores, respond to that? In a very similar way. Here you have your weevils, the Curculionidae, if you know that group. There's fewer species there in the exclosures because there's only one species to graze on or to feed on. Outside, there's more plant species, hence more weevils. Also more plant and leafhopper species. But if you look at earthworms, that don't like the trampling, I told you earlier, right? They favor the exclosures because there's less trampling, there's more food to be produced for them. So you see, and this is basically, by the way, this is a number of species, not so much numbers of individuals. I also have data on that, but you have more species of earthworms in the exclosures. And then, well, all other groups, we can look at spiders, predators, ground beetles, dung beetles, etc., all doing their thing. Quite complex. So it depends if it's positive or negative. overgrazing? Well, it depends on how to look at it. Yes, we lost some birds, but we gained some others. You can also do this multi-diversity score, and then it shows that actually on the edges, if you sum it all up, the ecotone idea actually, that's where you have then the highest diversity. Okay, so that's one thing that Roel van Klink did. The other thing that's very nice, I think, in such a productive system, we have all those carcasses of the red deer from the cattle and horses. They were taken out. They didn't have to, actually, the managers, but they did it because there was so much, and also the public didn't like it so much. There was a train passing by, and people could actually see the corpses laying in the field because it opened up so much. Red deer, however, were left alone, and we wanted to see what are the impacts of the red deer on diversity, of insects in this case. So we did pitfall traps around such a carcass, and we followed what happened there. And this is then the number of individuals in this case, and here it's the control, and here it's close to the carcass. And no surprise, number of arthropods is way higher, obviously, when you have this carcass. And they were primarily carrion-associated insects, and no difference in carnivores, herbivores, etc. More interesting thing was that we returned to that site 6 months later, and then the carcass had gone. You couldn't find it back at all, but at that site we had, and this is not me, but one of my PhD students, it's as tall as I am, 2 meters, so you had thistles that were about 3 meters tall. You could really see where the carcass had been by looking at the vegetation. If you then sample that area, then we found again a difference in your number of arthropods, but in this case it was because of your carnivores and your herbivores. Because those plants quadrupled in size, you had many more herbivores and their carnivorous insects, right? So there's been a huge shift then in your community, just simply by leaving carcasses, which is not allowed in many natural areas in the Netherlands. So this is a plea for letting those carcasses in your system where you can. And even in the Osvars Pleasant, where people say it's heavily overgrazed, this is a way to get more heterogeneity in your system, right? But it stopped March or February 2018. We had a severe winter, or actually 1 or 2 weeks, a very strong cold, and then more species died, or more grazers died. And then there was massive protest, and people throwing stacks of hay over the fence and cookies, even unwrapped. And they had huge barbecues in front of that first, before they started doing that, right? It's all animal welfare, but you know, we have to. Here it says, putting animals in and then let them starve is not nature. Anyways, they may have had a point, but here the ecological carrying capacity, in my view, nothing wrong with that, with bottom-up regulated processes. There's no carnivore in that system. You could say, well, perhaps we should take action. For me, it was a very interesting area. And they stopped it now, so the decision by court, it said we have to cull a lot, and there's room for maximum 1,500 animals. Well, we had like 6,000 to 7,000. And now it's a regular place as many other graze sites, in my view, which is a pity. So I lost interest in the site. But this is what happens also. You're part of society, of course. And, but there were actually a lot of death threats here of the managers, Frans Vera. It's terrible what happened. Culling deer, Koning horses were taken out. Exactly. Yeah. But it's, well, anyways. Last 5 minutes for the wolves, if I may. I'm going to do it anyways. Yeah. You may know the story of the Yellowstone, where wolves got reintroduced in the early 90s. And before that, the plains looked at that, so there was hardly any recruitment of trees, poplar, cottonwood. And this is Bob Besta, standing there just before or after the wolves got introduced. And then a few years later in the same site, and hey, trees are coming back. And the idea was that the wolves have impact directly by killing the elk, and also indirectly by imposing fear. So they, by their presence, the elk would avoid particular areas, these areas, because there's a risk of getting caught by wolves. Now, and there's also scientific evidence for that happened. So the recruits came back, or the trees recruited. And then there's this wonderful conceptual idea. It's conceptual, I should say. It's, you know, you have How Wolves Change Rivers YouTube movies, where this is sold as a hallelujah effect. There's little scientific evidence yet there. So in theory, you could say, well, there's more berries produced that has positive effects on bears, and more birds. The beaver is coming back. Even the stream morphology, because there's less erosion, will improve. A very nice conceptual idea, but largely still theoretical. Now we went to Poland. Actually, Dries Kuiper, one of my dear colleagues, is working there, where we have this natural community still with the lynx, not the Iberian lynx, but very nice species, wolves, European bison, etc. Unique area to study impacts of the wolves at the ecosystem. And one of the first things I did with a master student, together with Dries, is that we wanted to know if the ungulates would respond to olfactory cues of wolf. If you have an area where you have a fresh wolf scat, would you see a response in your ungulates? And there's a little movie, it doesn't run, but I'm running out of time, so it doesn't matter. This is here the behavior. So this is a movie, and we had several sites, some with this wolf scat and some comparable as control without wolf scat. And then we tracked all animals that came in, 15 seconds of video material, and then we scored the behavior. So how much percentage of their time was spent on foraging or walking, vigilance, etc. Now, for the red deer, the main prey species, it did respond quite strongly. So the vigilance, so that's ears up, scanning the environment, increased. And it came at the cost of foraging, which is quite interesting. So there is a response of the deer to this olfactory cue. While boar were not so much interested. In fact, they increased the sniffing, and it's also not the main prey species. Actually ate the wolf scat quite regularly. Bastard. Do you also find the response in the vegetation then? And this is work done by a master student from Wageningen University, and then later also published with Dries Kuiper. Yes, so this is the wolf core area where wolves hang out most of their time. Koenbold ran transects, and he scored the level of browsing on the saplings that he found here. And he found that there's, on average, 8% less browsing in that wolf core, which is interesting. And 8% is quite considerable, right, for saplings. It may matter if you survive or not. So, and it stopped at 180, or right, and then you're safe usually as a sapling. So there's less browsing indeed. So there seems to be cascading effects. And then one of my my PhD students, Annelies, she continued on that, and she also added those large tree trunks that you have a lot in this Biodiversity forest, beautiful, and that is an extra fear component, because if you're being chased by a wolf, you encounter this, you don't want to go there, right? Because your flight route is blocked, or there may be a lynx behind that. So she ran this experiment close to people and then in the wolf core area, and see that those protective effects through a tree log are way larger in this wolf core area as compared to close to humans. And here it's about 4 meters, here it's about an area of 60 meters. 2015, we were working in Poland because we had wolves there, and of course we were hoping that the wolf would once come back to the Netherlands, and then all of a sudden, typical Dutch landscape, and then we have wolves. It returned. And that was one of the first sightings, and then slightly later, they actually established. And it fits in the pattern that we see that many of the carnivores are expanding in Europe because of legislation, not because we're doing such a great job, but it's more conservation efforts and legislation. So it started already in the 80s in Poland and Germany. So now we have in the Netherlands about 20 individual wolves, about 3 packs over the last few years established. And the first pack was at the Veluwe area, I don't have a picture, but this is Apeldoorn. It's in the center of the Netherlands, basically. And around here, I'm not allowed to say where exactly, but around here we had the wolf nests. And we did this experiment where we have this gradient from close to wolves and further away from wolves. We again used our camera trap devices, but in this case we also used human trails. Well, there's no way to avoid them in the Netherlands because there's trails everywhere in each park. So you cannot walk without encountering a trail. But it also gave us the opportunity to test relative importance. So we want to see if ungulates respond to the wolf, but also do they still respond to humans, and what's more important. So we used this setup where we had distance to trails, human trails, 20 and 100 meters, and also distance from wolf center. And we collected camera trap data over the last 2 years. And that's Bjorn Mols, my PhD student, that is producing this paper at this moment. This is preliminary data. Well, about to be submitted, actually. Well, here it is. This is what we found. This is the visitation rate by, in this case, red deer, and this is by wild boar. This is the distance from your wolf nesting sites. So this is close to wolves and far away from wolves. And gray is your 100 meter from pass, and this is 20 meter from pass. My interpretation, our interpretation is indeed we seem to find impacts of wolves already after some years now. So the distance from the wolf core seems to have an effect, but only at 100 meters from the human trails. If you're too close at 20 meters distance, we know that humans have a huge impact. So the ungulates try to avoid that, at least during the day. They come out at night. We as humans are very predictable in our behavior. We're not allowed to go into natural areas at night, particularly not this area. So when we are away, the ungulates become, well, they're night active basically then. And now the question is, do they respond to the wolves? Well, there seems to be a wolf effect here. On the other hand, wolves are not so predictable in their behavior, of course, so we'll have to see. But I found this fascinating that we seem to find this first effect. Is this the last? No, 2 more slides. Okay. We had this nice setup, this 20 and 100 meter from trails set up already before the wolves established, actually. So we were able to show that in trails, that effect of trails on ungulate behavior. So there's less droppings close by at 20 meters as compared to 100 meters. When you seal off those trails, so you have the trail, everything is exactly the same, but humans are no longer allowed, and then this changes, right? So then they come out. Interesting thing is that you find a very similar pattern in your ticks distribution. So there's cascading effect of us, humans. We're scaring off the ungulates, basically, close to the trails, and as a side effect, there's also less ticks found close to the trails. Of course, we want to know the prevalence also of Lyme disease, then we didn't test that, but it would be interesting to also mention that in such a paper. And this is the last slide. This is the most recent findings using the same setup, 20 and 100 meters. This park is visited by 2 million visitors a year. It's a lot. It's a small park, there's paths everywhere. And they have been doing that for a very long time. So we thought, does that then also lead to ecosystem changes? If there is less browsing and less visits by red deer and ungulates close to trails, does it cascade into lower carbon or higher carbon in the soil? And we indeed seem to find that effect already here. So there's, well, above ground vegetation differences. We know that there's less browsing close to trails. And that leads to more litter also close to trails than further away. And even this effect seems to be significant according to the last models. So that's interesting in my view. I'd like to end it with that. Thanks for listening to this, and I'd like to open the floor for questions.
So thanks a lot, Chris, for your talk. Since we don't have that much time for a question, I'll start by repeating that you're around until next Friday, and you have an open invitation if people want to interact with you in office. 15?
15B.
B.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So, are there any questions? I'm also looking on the live chat on YouTube if you want to ask questions. I actually have one.
At least one question, please.
Now, I was wondering, I don't know if you have the data already, but I was curious if you would observe a difference in the ungulate response in areas where the predators have recently come back compared to areas where they've been, well, they were not extirpated.
Well, we compared Poland and the Netherlands in the response of ungulates to, well, wolf odor and soap and water. And there was a difference, but not in the wolf, what we expected. We wanted to know whether our deer would be naive and would no longer recognize the scent of wolves. But the remarkable thing was that the Polish deer responded very strongly to the soap. And it's also published, but we think it's because it's a relationship probably with humans. We thought soap was sort of a new scent to ungulates, but in fact they may associate it with people and therefore have a stronger effect. But that's in one of the papers. That's what we did. Nothing more than that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. It's for the online people, yeah.
Hi, very, very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. My question is actually related to the plant aspect of what you were talking about, because I'm a plant biologist. In your opinion, what, if and how do you think facilitative effects have an impact on stabilizing the biodiversity in the grazed parts of the 5 sites that you showed?
So the question is how facilitative effects can contribute to stability.
Sorry?
To stability, you say?
Yes, to stabilize the biodiversity.
Okay. How that works? Okay, I see. Yeah, so I'm not saying that there's... you can look at the different scales as well. So we did it as I think there were 1 by 1 meter plot scale. And at that scale, it's relatively stable. I had a nice discussion with another plant ecologist, Hans de Croo, and he said, well, you're wrong. So why? Well, if you look at even smaller scales, 5 by 5 centimeters, you see that species even switch within your quadrant over time. But I think the species pool remains relatively stable there at that scale, and and it's higher, the diversity. Simply because, well, it has to do, I guess, also with the grazing level there. So you remain most species of the species pool if it's not too intensive grazing. Whereas in the exclosures, you get the dominance effect, right? So some take over, but there are stochastic effects that make some species disappear, and then so that's probably what's happening. But diversity was there also lower in the exclosures. But is that? Yeah, but you were specifically asking for facilitative effects? Yeah. Oh, I need to think a little bit more about the mechanism. You probably also wrote on that in the paper, but yeah. We can talk later then. Yeah.
Do you have more questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if the mechanism you think of the carcasses on the biodiversity, is that mostly the nitrogen creating the plant growth in the structure increase?
I think it depends again on the system, right? This is a very productive system, and the species, the plant species that you have here are, I guess, still nitrogen limited. But if you go to more the Pleistocene sandy areas, the more nutrient limited areas, then you would get perhaps a different response. And so I guess it depends on which nutrients are most limited, at least the plant growth. Yeah.
It's interesting because I was thinking that it was because maybe the other herbivores avoided, like the larger herbivores, larger ungulates would maybe avoid because of the carcass, and that prevented them grazing, but then you said nitrogen.
No, we also mentioned, no, but it's a good remark because that also happens. The same as, say, temporary avoid dung patches,
Yeah,
right?
oh,
And after a
okay.
while, yeah, I mean, I can imagine, I don't eat well. Yeah, so it's partly that as well. But since we ran this experiment in the early in the season, I think from March onwards, there was hardly any vegetation growth anyways. So of course there was no grazing close to the carcass, but also further on there was very little grazing. So initially that didn't make the difference, and also the plant composition was fairly similar before and after. Yeah, I think it's not pure. I cannot exclude the possibility that's also avoidance of those areas, but I think it's really the nutrient addition because of the carcasses. Yeah, yeah. What is important is that there are no carnivores, or well, we have some foxes, but they're not entirely torn apart. There's no vultures, right? So the carcass remains more or less intact at that spot, which is quite unique. If you go to the Veluwe area where you have wild boar, it's spread all over the place, and then I think this huge growth of the plants is probably less clear, less visible, or maybe spread out over a larger area. So it is to a certain extent site-specific what we found here. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you. Is there one last question? No? Okay, then we're past the hour.
Yeah,
so
sorry for that.
no,
Yeah,
no
I was
problem.
getting enthusiastic here. Yeah.
But thank you very much for this talk. And again, 15B until Friday, if people want to talk to Chris. And so yeah, this was our last seminar, and if I'm not mistaken, the next one for this year the next one in January will be on the 12th of January. That's when we resume the sessions. So thank you, and
Okay.
see you next year.
Thank you.